February 1964. The world was going insane. A plane had just landed at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, and outside, thousands of teenagers were screaming so loud you could feel it in your chest. Police officers struggled to hold back the crowd. Girls were fainting. Boys were climbing fences. Reporters were shouting questions that nobody could hear over the chaos. Inside that plane sat 4 young men from Liverpool who had no idea their lives were about to change forever. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. The Beatles. They looked out the window at the madness below, and even John Lennon, the one who always had a clever remark, was speechless. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. This was Beatlemania. And it was just beginning. Across the country in Los Angeles, a man sat in his living room watching the news coverage on television. He held a glass of apple juice, though everyone assumed it was something stronger. A cigarette burned between his fingers. His face showed no expression as he watched these 4 young British kids step off the plane into a hurricane of flashbulbs and screaming fans. Dean Martin was 46 years old. He had been famous for 2 decades. He had seen trends come and go. He had watched stars rise and fall. He had survived the collapse of his partnership with Jerry Lewis, reinvented himself as a solo artist, become a movie star, and established himself as one of the biggest names in entertainment. And now, according to everyone in the industry, he was finished. The newspapers were already writing his obituary. Not literally, but professionally. Rock and roll was taking over. The crooners were done. The era of Sinatra and Martin and Como was ending. These young kids with their electric guitars and their mop-top haircuts were the future. Dean Martin and everything he represented was the past. Dean watched the Beatles wave to the crowd on his television screen. He took a drag from his cigarette. "Good luck, kids," he said to no one. "You're gonna need it." But Dean Martin wasn't bitter. That wasn't his style. He was genuinely curious about these 4 young men who had captured the world's attention. He wanted to understand what made them special, and more than that, he recognized something in their eyes, something he had seen in his own mirror 20 years earlier. Hunger, talent, and absolutely no idea what was coming. The Beatles' first week in America was a blur of television appearances, press conferences, and hysteria. They performed on The Ed Sullivan Show to an audience of 73 million people. They held a press conference where John Lennon's quick wit charmed the American media. They were everywhere, on every channel, on every radio station, on the cover of every magazine. But beneath the excitement, the 4 young men were overwhelmed. Nothing in Liverpool, nothing in Hamburg, nothing in London had prepared them for this. America was bigger, louder, and more intense than anything they had experienced. John Lennon, in particular, was struggling. He hid it well behind his sharp humor and confident exterior, but inside he was terrified. He had built walls around himself since childhood, since his mother had abandoned him, since his father had disappeared, since he learned that the only way to survive was to never let anyone see you bleed. Now, suddenly, the whole world was watching. Every word he said was analyzed. Every move he made was photographed. Every joke he told was printed in newspapers around the globe. He couldn't make a mistake. He couldn't show weakness. He had to be John Lennon 24 hours a day. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. And he had no one to talk to about it. Paul was too optimistic. George was too quiet. Ringo was too new. Brian Epstein, their manager, was too focused on business. John Lennon was surrounded by people and completely alone. 2 weeks into their American invasion, the Beatles attended a party in Los Angeles. It was one of those Hollywood events where everyone who mattered was supposed to be seen. Actors, directors, producers, musicians. The old guard and the new guard, mixing uneasily in a mansion in the hills. The Beatles arrived and immediately became the center of attention. People crowded around them. Celebrities who had been famous for decades suddenly wanted photographs with these 4 kids from Liverpool. It was surreal. It was flattering. It was suffocating. John stood near the bar trying to catch his breath. He had escaped the crowd for a moment, hiding in the corner with a drink he was too young to legally have in America. He was 23 years old, and he felt like he was drowning. That's when he noticed the man standing alone on the other side of the room. Dean Martin. John recognized him immediately. Everyone knew Dean Martin. The voice, the movies, the television show, the Rat Pack. Dean Martin was everything John's generation was supposed to be rebelling against. He was the old establishment, the crooner, the guy in the tuxedo with the martini glass. But there was something about him that caught John's attention. While everyone else in the room was trying to get close to the Beatles, Dean Martin wasn't. He stood by himself, drink in hand, watching the chaos with an amused expression. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that 4 young men had just stolen all the attention in the room. John was intrigued. In his experience, famous people didn't handle being upstaged very well. They got jealous. They got competitive. They made snide comments. But Dean Martin just stood there, looking like he was exactly where he wanted to be. Before John could think too much about it, Dean looked up and caught his eye. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The young revolutionary and the old king. The future and the past. 2 men who had nothing in common except the strange, isolating experience of being famous. Then Dean smiled and raised his glass in a small salute. John didn't know what to do. His instinct was to make a joke, to deflect, to put up his usual wall of wit and sarcasm. But something about Dean's expression stopped him. There was no judgment in that smile, no competition, just recognition. John raised his own glass in return. Dean walked over. "You're one of those Beatles," Dean said. It wasn't a question. "Guilty as charged," John replied, falling back on his standard defense mechanism. Dean studied him for a moment. Those famous hooded eyes taking in everything. John felt like he was being X-rayed. "Hell of a week you've had." "Yeah, it's been something." "Something." Dean chuckled. "That's one word for it. I remember my first something. Didn't sleep for a month. Thought I was going to lose my mind." John blinked. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected Dean Martin, the epitome of cool, to admit to any kind of vulnerability. "How did you handle it?" John asked before he could stop himself. Dean took a sip of his drink. "Honestly, I didn't. Not for a long time. I made every mistake you could make. Trusted the wrong people. Believed what they wrote about me. Let the whole circus get inside my head. And then I figured something out. Took me years, but I figured it out." John waited. For once, he didn't have a clever response. He just wanted to hear what this man had to say. Dean looked at him. Really looked at him. Past the famous face, past the mop-top haircut, past the carefully constructed image of the witty Beatle. He looked at the 23-year-old kid underneath who was scared and overwhelmed and had no idea what he had gotten himself into. "Can I give you some advice, kid?" John nodded. Dean leaned in slightly. When he spoke, his voice was low, serious. The lazy drunk persona was gone. This was the real Dean Martin, and he had something important to say. "Don't let them own your soul." 6 words. That was it. Don't let them own your soul. John stared at him. Dean continued, his voice still quiet. "They're going to tell you who you are. The press, the managers, the record executives, the fans. They're going to create a version of you and sell it to the world. And that version is going to make them a lot of money. But it's not you. It was never you. And if you're not careful, you'll start to believe it. You'll become the thing they invented. And the real you? He'll disappear. And you won't even notice until it's too late." John felt something cold move through his chest, because Dean Martin had just described his deepest fear. The fear he had never spoken aloud to anyone. "How do you stop it?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dean finished his drink and set the glass down. "You remember who you were before all this. Before the screaming and the flashbulbs and the money. You hold on to that kid. You protect him. Because everyone else is going to try to kill him. They don't mean to, but they will. The only one who can keep him alive is you." John was quiet for a long moment. The party swirled around them. People laughed, glasses clinked, music played. But John Lennon and Dean Martin stood in their own bubble of silence. "Why are you telling me this?" John finally asked. Dean smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of a man who had learned these lessons the hard way. "Because I wish someone had told me. When I was your age, standing where you're standing, feeling what you're feeling. I wish some old bastard had pulled me aside and warned me. Maybe I would have listened. Probably not. But maybe." He reached out and put a hand on John's shoulder. "You've got something, kid. I can see it. You're not just another pretty face with a guitar, there's something real in there. Don't let them take it from you. Don't let them turn you into a product. The money comes and goes. The fame comes and goes. But your soul, that's the only thing that's really yours. Guard it." Dean patted John's shoulder once, then dropped his hand. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go find some pasta. These Hollywood parties never have enough food." And just like that, the lazy smile was back. The cool was back. Dean Martin sauntered off toward the buffet, leaving John Lennon standing alone with 6 words echoing in his head. "Don't let them own your soul." The Beatles' American tour continued. The madness intensified. The records sold. The concerts packed stadiums. The world fell deeper and deeper in love with these 4 boys from Liverpool. But John Lennon never forgot that conversation. In the years that followed, as Beatlemania reached its peak and then began to suffocate them, as the pressure became unbearable, as the 4 friends began to drift apart under the weight of their own success, John would think about Dean Martin's words. Don't let them own your soul. He thought about them when he met Yoko Ono and fell in love with someone the whole world told him was wrong for him. He thought about them when he walked away from the Beatles, the most successful band in history, because it was killing the real John Lennon inside. He thought about them when he retreated from public life to raise his son, choosing to be a father instead of a Beatle. Every major decision John Lennon made in his adult life was, in some way, an attempt to follow Dean Martin's advice, to not let them own his soul, to protect the real person underneath the legend. In 1975, John Lennon gave an interview where he talked about the early days of Beatlemania. The interviewer asked him if anyone had ever given him advice that stuck with him. John was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "You know who gave me the best advice I ever got? Dean Martin. Can you believe that? Dean Bloody Martin. We met at some party in LA during our first American tour. I was 23, completely terrified, pretending I had it all figured out. And this bloke, this crooner my parents' generation loved, he comes up to me and tells me the only thing I actually needed to hear." The interviewer leaned forward. "What did he say?" John's smile faded into something more serious. He said, "Don't let them own your soul." 6 words, that's all. But Christ, I've thought about those 6 words more than anything anyone else ever told me. More than anything any guru or therapist or friend ever said. Because he was right. That's exactly what they try to do. The industry, the media, the machine. They try to buy your soul. And if you let them, you're finished. You might still be walking around, making records, doing interviews, but the real you is dead. Did you take his advice? John laughed. I tried. God knows I tried. I didn't always succeed. There were years when I completely lost myself, when I became exactly the product they wanted me to be. But I always remembered what Dean said, and eventually I fought my way back. I found myself again, or at least I'm still looking. But I'm looking because of that conversation, because Dean Martin of all people told me my soul was worth protecting. The interviewer asked one more question. Did you ever see him again? Did you ever thank him? John shook his head. No, we never crossed paths again. I always meant to write him a letter, but I never did. I regret that. I'd like him to know that some kid actually listened, that his words mattered. Dean Martin never knew about that interview. He never knew that his brief conversation with a young John Lennon had shaped the trajectory of one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. That was Dean's way. He gave advice and moved on. He didn't need credit. He didn't need gratitude. He just did what felt right and let the universe sort out the rest. But the story doesn't end there. In 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment building in New York City. He was 40 years old. The world mourned. Music mourned. An entire generation mourned. When Dean Martin heard the news, he was at home in Beverly Hills. He sat in his favorite chair, staring at the television, watching the coverage of the murder of a man he had met only once, 36 years earlier. Dean didn't say much. That wasn't his way. But his daughter Dina later recalled that her father was unusually quiet that night. He went to bed early, and the next morning, she found him in the living room, holding an old photograph. It was a picture from that 1964 party. Someone had taken a snapshot of Dean and John talking in the corner. Dean didn't even remember keeping it. But there it was. Two men, two generations, two worlds, captured in a single moment. "Dad?" Dina asked. "Are you okay?" Dean looked at the photograph for a long moment. "He was just a kid," Dean said quietly. "Scared kid, trying to figure it all out. Just like we all were. Did you know him well?" Dean shook his head. "We talked once. Just once. I told him something I wished someone had told me. I don't know if he even remembered." Dina didn't press further. Her father wasn't one to share his feelings, and she knew better than to push. But years later, after Dean himself had passed away, Dina came across that 1975 interview where John talked about his conversation with her father. She read John's words, about how Dean's 6-word advice had shaped his entire life, about how he thought about it constantly, about how he regretted never thanking Dean. She wept. Her father had no idea. He went to his grave not knowing that a brief conversation at a party had meant so much to someone, that his words had echoed through decades, that John Lennon, one of the greatest artists who ever lived, considered Dean Martin's advice to be the most important he ever received. That's the thing about kindness, about wisdom, about taking a moment to connect with another human being. You never know what impact you'll have. You never know which words will stick. You never know whose life you might change with a single conversation. Dean Martin saw a scared young man at a party in 1964. He could have ignored him. He could have been jealous of the attention the Beatles were getting. He could have dismissed them as a passing fad. Instead, he walked over and shared something real, something from his own painful experience, something that cost him nothing to give but meant everything to receive. Don't let them own your soul. 6 words, spoken once, never forgotten. John Lennon spent the rest of his life trying to follow that advice, fighting to remain himself in a world that wanted to turn him into a product, struggling to protect the real person underneath the legend. And when he finally found peace, when he finally felt like he had reclaimed his soul, he credited a conversation with Dean Martin, the crooner and the Beatle, the old guard and the new, 2 men who supposedly had nothing in common. But they had the most important thing in common. They both knew what it meant to be famous. They both knew the price it extracted. And they both understood that your soul is the only thing you truly own. Dean Martin gave John Lennon a gift that night in 1964. Not an autograph, not a photograph, not a professional connection. He gave him the truth. And John Lennon carried that truth with him until the day he died. That's the story they don't tell you about Dean Martin. Not the songs, not the movies, not the Rat Pack legends. The story of a man who saw a frightened kid and took the time to help him. 6 words, a lifetime of impact. Don't let them own your soul.